the best way to describe the basics of mergers and acquisitions and how M&A deals work is to take you through the timeline of a deal from start to finish. So in this video, we will be doing just that. Make sure to stay until the end of the video to learn about stamp duty tax on the purchase of shares. If you're new, I'm Malcolm Zoppi, an English qualified solicitor, and I help UK SMEs with their corporate and commercial legal needs. Great, so I'm going to be sharing my screen now so we can look at the main stages of an M&A deal and discuss the basics that are relevant to an M&A deal. Great, so the first thing is heads of terms. Heads of terms, in short, are a summary of the deal. They summarize what the parties have agreed, and that tends to be translated in a much longer sale and purchase agreement, whether that is a share purchase agreement or an asset purchase agreement. A few key things that we'll be discussing: what the purchase price is, whether that purchase price is locked or is based on completion accounts, and so on. Typically, the heads of terms will state that the buyer will be conducting due diligence on the target business. Which brings us to the next stage. The buyer will create a list of questions they will want to send to the seller's solicitors. The buyer or the buyer's solicitors will create a list of questions to be sent to the seller's solicitors, and then the sellers will compile the relevant documentation to evidence the answers to the questions that the buyer has posed and upload those documents to what is called a virtual data room, where the seller uploads information, the buyer accesses that information, and conducts due diligence on the target business. The term virtual data room actually comes from past acquisitions, whereby typically the buyers would actually physically attend the premises of the target business, and the sellers of the target business would set up a data room within their premises where the buyers would spend their time, or the buyer's advisors would spend their time looking at documents from morning until evening, and then go home at night and do the same the following morning. Great, so we've now discussed already that the seller will be disclosing information to the buyer, and once the buyer or the buyer's advisors have reviewed those documents, they will likely have more follow-up questions. Those are again sent to the seller. The seller responds by disclosing further documents or making clarifications. Then the advisors of the buyer, typically the buyer's solicitors, as well as the accountants, would prepare a due diligence report for the buyer to digest. The report can come in two main forms. First is a red flag report, whereby the advisors only report on the red flags or issues that they have identified with the target business. Or secondly, the advisors can report on everything, and hence summarizing the target business for the buyer. What I like to do when I deliver a legal due diligence report to my buyers is identify, yes, the legal issues, but then also quote for the remedial work that would be required to put right the legal issues that I have identified. This quote is then used by the buyers of the business to negotiate, if they want, a price reduction with the sellers of the business. If a price reduction is indeed achieved, then the buyer is receiving a better business for the same amount of money. If a reduction in purchase price is not achieved, the buyer is not compelled to conduct remedial work, and definitely not compelled to conduct remedial work before they even bought that business. Now, why did we spend so much time discussing due diligence? Well, the reason being is that when it comes to buying a business, the concept of caveat emptor, which means let the buyer beware, applies. And in simple terms, that means that it is the buyer's obligation to satisfy themselves as to the state of the business and to make sure that they are happy with what the business is like. It is not like a consumer product that you can order online and then you have 14 days cooling off period to decide to return. If you bought it, you better be happy with it. So that means due diligence is extremely important to make sure that you make an informed decision and the right decision. Once due diligence will have been completed, the buyer's solicitors will draft the SPA, the sale and purchase agreement, as well as the ancillary documents. It is for the buyer's solicitors to draft these, and then these will be negotiated with the seller's solicitors. For buyers, you'll want to include as many warranties and indemnities in the SPA as possible. Warranties, as a side note, are promises that the sellers are making as to the state of the business. So, for example, you might want to include warranties stating that the target business has always paid its corporate tax and doesn't owe any sort of tax to HMRC. If this turns out to be not true, then the buyer can sue the sellers for a breach of warranty and either set off against the deferred payment that is still outstanding of the purchase price, or if the entire purchase price has already been paid to the sellers, then they will need to claim against the sellers and get the sellers to pay the buyer. Important to note that the right to set off is not an automatic right that one has. You should look to include the right to set off in your SPA, and ideally this will be included in your heads of terms right here, as if it's not, then typically it's not going to be in the SPA. Great, so once we've agreed between the buyer and the seller the form of the SPA and the ancillary documents, we're ready to proceed to completion. Exchange and completion, in short, are where the contracts are signed and the monies are transferred from the buyer to the seller. And lastly, we have post-completion procedural matters. Now, these are especially relevant when it comes to share purchases, because, for example, you'll want to issue new share certificates, update the statutory registers, and update the company's house profile of the target company to reflect, for example, the new directors and new people with significant control. But there's also stamp duty to be paid. But before we discuss about stamp duty, feel free to send me an email if looking for professional legal advice. So a lot of people actually forget about stamp duty and don't budget for this cost when looking to buy a business. Stamp duty is payable on the purchase of shares where the purchase price is above £1,000. At the time of recording this video, stamp duty is payable at 0.5% of the purchase price. Now, we discussed the importance of the heads of terms and how they govern the progress of the deal. But how do you draft heads of terms and how do you use them to your advantage? To find out, make sure to watch this video right here.